I'm Emma Lubitch, and you're watching CAN TV. We're here today with Sarah Staudt from Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice. So thank you so much for being with us. So can you talk about the work that you do at Chicago Appleseed and then how that work has kind of shifted because of obviously the times we're living in with the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure. So at Chicago Appleseed, we do reform of our courts and our court systems. We improve lives by improving courts. I'm our senior policy analyst for criminal justice work. So during normal times, I work on everything from sentencing reform to bond reform to looking at the impact that Kim Foxx has had on Cook County, a whole range of things. Obviously, when COVID hit in March, we very quickly realized that there was a crisis going on because we have the largest what's called single site jail in the country, which basically just means that it's only one complex, it's only one building. And the conditions were perfect for a COVID-19 outbreak. And indeed, that outbreak happened. And during that time, I switched over a lot of my work to analyzing that outbreak, getting information out about it, and working with system players to try and get people out of the jail and save their lives, frankly.
And so, as you said, a population that has been so incredibly hard hit by COVID-19 is people who are incarcerated. So can you describe the conditions in these facilities that essentially just make their population so susceptible?
Well, fundamentally, it's just that you can't social distance in jail, right? So most jails, and particularly Cook County Jail, are not set up so that every person has a cell. That's more common in prisons, although even prisons usually have 2 people cells. But in our jails, a lot of people live in dormitory settings. So big rooms like a high school gymnasium with multiple bunks that are often only 3 or 4 feet apart. Everybody eats together, they sleep together, they exercise together. And so it's just impossible to do the things that we've all learned to do over the past couple months about staying, distanced from people and making sure that we're not breathing each other's air, because in our jails, we're usually just people are right on top of each other.
So Illinois had put some measures in place to curb the spread of the infection, like Pritzker's transfer ban, which was recently struck down by a county judge. So can you just explain that and then what impact these transfers have kind of on transmission of the virus?
Right. So, we have 2 different systems, right? We have a jail system, which is the jail that's right next to 26 in California, that holds people who are held pretrial before they've had their case resolved. And then we have our prison system, which exists throughout the state of Illinois. The giant COVID outbreak was at the jail. That's why the ban to transfer was put into place, because they didn't want to bring that outbreak into IDOC facilities, into prison facilities. Obviously for the reason of you don't want an outbreak in those facilities, but an outbreak in prison facilities is particularly bad. Most of these prison facilities are in tiny little towns that are isolated and really just do not have the capacity to deal with an outbreak at the local prison. When there was an outbreak at Stateville, outside of Joliet, the National Guard had to be called in to provide additional resources. So that ban was in place for a very, very long time to make sure that we were keeping the prisons as safe from new cases of COVID as possible. I actually still think that ban is really important, and I wish it was still in place. It was lifted because, of course, if you have people who have been sentenced to prison and are ready to go to prison, and you don't send them to prison, they stay in the jail. And that eventually will start driving jail populations up. In Cook County, we've been able to sort of adjust to it, but in a tiny county in downstate Illinois, where their jail only has less than 100 beds, it had apparently become a real problem.
Cook County Jail was a hotspot for COVID-19 in the early stages of the pandemic. In Chicago, but also across the country. Mm-hmm. So after a suit was filed, a judge ordered a preliminary injunction forcing the Cook County Sheriff's Office to implement some safety measures to help curb the spread of the virus. So that injunction is still in place today. Can you talk about the timeline of kind of what occurred at Cook County Jail and then where we are today?
Sure, absolutely. So we got our first news that there was a COVID-19 case at the jail in mid-March. Our first death was in late March, early April. By the time this particular wave of the outbreak ran its course, we had had 7 deaths, as well as dozens of hospitalizations. What we knew as from people inside, from actually speaking to both detainees and their lawyers from early on, is that in early April, there was almost, the response to COVID-19 was wholly inadequate. There weren't masks, there wasn't cleaning, and it was impossible to social distance because there were too many people in the jail. The jail population was over 5,000 at that point. And so that is when a number of lawyers, some from Lovie and Lovie, filed a lawsuit, a class action on behalf of detainees that led eventually to the preliminary injunction. And it required that, the court basically required that Sheriff Staudt implement real social distancing. So make sure that people are not in, crowded dorms, or at least that those dorms are not at full capacity. So you don't have people sleeping 3 feet from each other. Make sure that everybody has PPE, and do more cleaning than had been happening. And the court kept Sheriff Staudt under this preliminary injunction at this point until such a time as the sheriff asks to be released from it and the judge agrees. So pretty much indefinitely, or until this this situation changes. And the reason he did that is he said that obviously Sheriff Staudt and his staff had been working hard to curb the pandemic, but that some of the changes that were made, particularly around social distancing and PPE, Sheriff Staudt didn't make voluntarily. He made them because they were ordered by the court. And so the court said, the judge said, I still need to be actively enforcing a court order here to make sure everybody remains safe. And that's the situation we're in today.
Okay. And how have those numbers, so what essentially has happened then with the numbers of COVID cases at Cook County?
So soon after the preliminary injunction went into place, and some of those social distancing measures were put into place, the cases finally started to plateau. And that was in sort of early May. The jail population had also by that point decreased hugely. So starting in late March, we had seen public defenders, state's attorneys work together to get as many people out of jail who could be let out as possible, and a huge effort also from communities to post people's bonds who couldn't afford them. And between those two things, we dropped the jail population by a little over 1,500 people. And because there were relatively few arrests in April, because we were all sitting in our houses, the jail population fell pretty dramatically. So the cases finally plateaued because people could sit far enough apart from each other in the jail is like the easiest way to talk about it. Right. Then starting in May, we hit the lowest the jail population has ever been. And now slowly the population has started to creep upward. Now, luckily, so far, we haven't seen another full-scale outbreak. There are still lots of COVID-19 cases in the jail, and there are new positive cases being diagnosed, but so far we have not seen the runaway transmission we saw in April. But the jail passed the 5,000 person mark just this week, and we are quickly approaching a time where those conditions are going to look just like they did in late March and early April when we did see a huge outbreak and deaths. So I'm very, very concerned that we are not keeping up the effort to continue to reduce the jail population during this time. Because, in our own lives, those of us who aren't incarcerated, we're all worried about, increased transmission that could happen sort of at any time. The jail, if it hits, will be hit very, very hard. So it's important to, I think it should be important to everyone that we do our best to decrease that jail population and keep it at a level where social distancing is possible, because ultimately our jail is in our community. People who move through our jails move through our communities. A preliminary study suggested that maybe 1 out of every 6 cases in Cook County was ultimately traced back to the jail outbreak, which is a lot. And it shows how conditions in the jail really do affect all of us. So we need to keep up the pressure to decarcerate.
And so can we talk about pretrial detention specifically? So many people who are held in Cook County Jail are there solely because they can't pay their bond. So
Correct.
what percentage of people in detention are there really because they just can't pay to get out?
So basically, there's a mix of people. There are people who are held and have been found by a judge. They can't have a bond. They have no bond. There are also people who violated their probation, which often results in being held without the ability to post bond. But there are still hundreds and hundreds of people who just have money bonds. The total number is a little over 1,500 as of July 31st. So that's a lot of people. And those are the people who you could walk in and pay money and they would walk out. So what really needs to happen is, money bonds are supposed to be affordable. The way they're supposed to work, if they work, is you pay money, know that that money is going to be taken away if you don't show up at court, and then you show up at court. And at the end of the case, guilty or not guilty, you get your money back. We often don't use money bond appropriately or legally in Cook County, and we in fact set bonds that are way, way, way above what people can actually post. What we need to do is everyone who's still in the jail, who's on a money bond, sort of by definition, we now know they can't post that bond, right? No one is just sitting for fun for more than 7 days in the jail. If they don't have the money, they don't have the money, which means that case needs to be brought back in front of a judge to figure out, is there a bond? Is there a reasonable bond that can be reset so this person can post that bond and get out of jail?
What is the safest solution then to this crisis? I mean, so many people have called for large scale releases. And if that is the avenue that you take, what does that look like? What goes into that?
So I think, early on when we were trying to decarcerate quickly, our first call was for large scale releases. There are people in our jail who just don't belong there. We have people who are charged with low-level felonies, with nonviolent felonies, with misdemeanors. We have people serving misdemeanor sentences in jail. Things that just, in a crisis, an unprecedented crisis like this, incarcerating those people is even more damaging and unnecessary than it usually is. So mass release of people with those kinds of charges was something we were seeking. We still want that. There are, thankfully, not as many people in the jail, percentage-wise, who have those kinds of cases. But there still are a lot. There are hundreds of people who are incarcerated on low-level felonies, and thousands of people who are incarcerated, over 1,000 people who are incarcerated on felonies that can still end in probation, meaning that they might never see prison time at all. So we really do need to be looking at every single person in the jail and saying, why are they there? Do they need to be there? Absolutely, because we think there's no other way to keep people safe. And if not, how do we get them out? And now that it's 5.5 months in, there's a range of answers to that. There are people in the jail who just need to resolve their cases. State's attorneys need to look at the case. Sometimes a plea deal needs to be reached. Sometimes a case needs to be dismissed, what have you. Sometimes a case needs to go to a bench trial and have a judge actually decide whether the person is guilty or innocent. But those cases just need to be resolved, and often are going to be resolved not for prison time, right? And then the person is on probation and can go home. So we need to see more resolutions of cases. The courts are open,
Right.
but they're open very slowly, essentially. We know that we're not having very many trials if we're having them. And a lot of cases just aren't moving. They're sitting and getting kicked to the next court date and the next court date. And that's going to be a really big problem as the cases build up, because of course cases are still entering the system when new people are arrested. So that's something that we're really focused on now, is how can we help the system accelerate some of those cases now that we're out of total emergency damage control mode, where we can only have the most important bail cases. Now our judges are sitting in Zoom courtrooms. Some things are done at distance in person. Most things are done on Zoom, but that's okay. There's a lot we can do on Zoom to have the court system function And that would go a long way to making sure that the jail population stays reasonable. Because right now, the ways that people leave the jail are mostly closed, and the ways that people enter the jail are not.